Hello and welcome back. Today we're continuing our lecture series on the 1920s. Specifically, today we're going to be focusing on African Americans during the 1920s. Uh, there's 1920s is a time period where there's lots of change. We in previous lectures have talked about the change that women in America are going through in the 1920s. We're going to see a very similar thing happening for African Americans in the 1920s as well. I think so far, and we've talked about the history of African Americans a lot in previous lectures. But in the previous lectures, a lot of what we had to talk about was slavery and the impact of slavery and Jim Crow and sharecropping in the South. And we still have Jim Crow in the South. We still have a lot of racial discrimination, particularly in the South, that's happening. But in the 1920s, you start to really see, that things are getting better for African Americans as a community in the United States. And we get to talk about a lot of positive things that are happening for African Americans here in the United States. And so it's kind of an exciting time period to talk about African American history. What has happened is African Americans are actually able to escape the South, and that's because of World War One, right? During World War One, we have a lot of African Americans that escape sharecropping in the South and take factory jobs in the North that white men used to have, but abandoned because they went overseas to fight. And so, when their African Americans did fight in World War One, but the vast majority of the soldiers in World War One were white, and so the country rounded up millions of soldiers, shipped them overseas, but all of those soldiers had jobs, and those jobs had to be filled, and so African American men were able to, fill those jobs and get good paying jobs, really kind of for the first time. And not to say that by this point we've had black millionaires and that has happened, but that was the exception rather than the rule. But you're in the 1920s, we're really going to start to see opportunity for the first time. Remember, after slavery, from the 1860s onward, African Americans, because of sharecropping, were trapped in systemic debt, right? Sharecropping was set up and designed to keep Black people in debt to their former owners and masters. And, they didn't have enough money to be able to move to find a new job or a better life in the North. Some did, some risked a lot to be able to do that, but the average Black person couldn't do that. During World War One, what you see is the northern factories get so desperate for workers that they're willing to overcome some prejudices they had. And not only are they willing to hire African Americans, in a lot of cases, they're willing to pay for African Americans to move up north to fill these jobs. And so you see at first in what was known as the Great Migration, but you see, essentially millions of young African American men moving up north, getting these jobs where they actually can make more than they spend, which means they can save up some money, send that money back down to their family in the South and be able to bring their family up with them eventually into the North, where there's better job opportunities, better education, and just an overall better life. And so, when that happens, all of a sudden now, you're going to start to see African Americans getting more involved. Once you're able to meet the basic needs in life, a roof over your head, food on your table, and save a little bit of money. All of a sudden now you start to free up some time to be able to pursue the arts. And I got to tell you, art in America is a lot of it is, relies heavily upon African Americans' contributions, particularly when you're talking about, music and things along those lines. And so you're going to see African American political thought, you're going to see African American music and poetry and literature all kind of flourish in the 1920s. So the first thing we're going to do talking about African American during the 1920s is we're going to talk about kind of political thought. Now, in the 1920s, there's really kind of, there's several different philosophies that African Americans have for how to deal with, being Black in America. And each one of those different thoughts, there's three main kind of approaches that African Americans have towards, politics in America. And each one of those three approaches essentially has, a person associated as the leader of that approach. And so the first guy we want to talk about is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois is an amazing guy. He's going to be the first African American PhD recipient from Harvard University. He's gets his PhD in sociology, so he studies how society works. So his opinion on how to kind of deal with cultural problems. I mean, he's an expert on the material. And, he is going to do some pretty important things. First of all, he's going to help establish the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is an organization that is designed to essentially help African Americans, right? If you're facing, any kind of discrimination, or if you get arrested wrongfully, they'll help, provide attorneys. They'll help you find a job. They'll do all kinds of, it's an instrumental group in the civil rights movement later in the 1960s, 1950s and 60s. And, he is also going to write, sociological papers studying African Americans, the African American community in the United States. And one of the things that he quickly comes to realize is that he thinks African Americans should essentially strive to be the best that they can be individually. And that if you are able to, if you work hard and do your best, there's essentially no limit to what an African American can achieve in America. And so he says all African Americans should try to get the most education possible, be an engineer, be a doctor, be a lawyer, do all those kind of things. And he writes about that in the book that he publishes called The Souls of Black Folk, where he essentially writes out an argument that intellectually destroys the idea of white supremacy, or that, white people are able to do things that African Americans can't. I mean, he's a perfect example of how that's idiocy, right? He's a PhD from Harvard. And so he essentially says, if you as African Americans go out, I mean, you can't make a claim that African Americans are intellectually inferior if your doctor is a Black man, right? And so, like my doctor, or at least my doctor growing up. And so, it's, he says, strive for the best. And if you do that, eventually you'll be mainstreamed into society. And so society will eventually accept African Americans. And and so his vision is, if we continue to strive, eventually America will have a Black president. Eventually, we're going to accept Black people as just Black people, right? And so, essentially, make a difference, choose to be the best version of yourself, and eventually, that will happen. Now, he's not the only person. And so this is, I think, this is kind of the philosophy I think that most people have today, right? It's that there is still prejudice in this world. There's still racism in this world, in the world and in our country, and the best way to challenge that is to show how ridiculous the nature of racism is. And so, the more African Americans with an education, the more African Americans that own businesses, that are doctors and lawyers, it becomes very difficult to make any kind of logical argument for racial superiority. And so that's what W.E.B. Du Bois. It's Du Bois. I like to say Du Bois because it sounds French. It makes me sound smart. But that's what W.E.B. Du Bois is striving for. So he's not the only African American intellectual leader. There are two more that we're going to talk about. So if Du Bois is talking about be the best version of you, get as much education, be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. You've got another heavyweight African American intellectual thinker in Booker T. Washington that says, yeah, that sounds great, but slow down just a little bit. He's got a different view. Booker T. Washington, again, super intellectual, teaches himself how to read. He ends up running Tuskegee University, which is essentially it's a university for African Americans. Teaches mostly like skilled labor kind of jobs and vocational work. And he has a slightly different view, a view that's less idealistic. And very specifically, Booker T. Washington is incredibly educated. He's incredibly intelligent, and he understands, because this is important that you understand this. He understands that African Americans are just as capable as white people. He just thinks that white society isn't quite ready yet in the 1920s for true equality between the races. And he believes that if African Americans demand equality, true equality, before society is ready for it, there'll be a backlash against African Americans. And so he says, slow down a little bit, right? Instead of trying to, be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, because society might not be ready, white society might not be ready for that. What you need to do is get just enough education to make your life a little bit better. Go if you're, a field hand, get just enough education to be a plumber or a carpenter or, maybe a school teacher or a craftsman, right? That'll get you into the middle class. And then white society will have time to acclimate to that and then get used to that. And then your kids can go to college and become doctors, lawyers, and engineers. And then it's not so quick of a change that might cause a reaction against African Americans. And so he says you should get just enough education to make your life a little bit better, but not so much as to scare white people into thinking that black people are taking over or, whatever. And, and that might cause a setback. So, be a farmer, be an artisan, learn to be, a carpenter or something along those lines. And then once society gets used to us kind of being in the middle class, then your children can then be the doctors and lawyers and then society will be comfortable with, rich African Americans, and then their kids can break into the political class and be congressmen and senators and presidents. And then eventually we'll get to true equality. So Booker T. Washington takes a more mild approach than does W.E.B. Du Bois. But he really truly wants the same thing. He just wants to do it in a way that he believes is more practical. Right? He wants realistic goals. Now, so we've got Du Bois, that's like, nope, we equality now, strive for the best you can be. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, congressmen, senators, do it now. We got Booker T. Washington, that's like, let's go a little bit slower so we don't upset society too much. Still try to make your life better, but let's do it in a way where there might not be violent resistance, particularly in the South. Let's do it slow, and where society will accept it a little bit quicker. And then the third approach, and the third leader of that approach, is going to be Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey takes an absolutely different approach to both of those two. Both Du Bois and Booker want equality within America, right? They want equal treatment between whites and blacks in the United States. Marcus Garvey, who is going to be one of the founders of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, he's going to say that's not possible. He's going to say, nope, the reality is whites will never accept blacks. They'll never accept African Americans as their boss or as their president, or they're never going to give us a fair shot. They're never going to give up power. And so shooting for equality is unrealistic. And what we should do is we should just separate ourselves from white people. He's going to start a Back to Africa movement. And he thinks that African Americans should just go back to Africa, where they can be surrounded by people who look like them. And that's the only way they'll ever get a fair shot. He starts a company, raises money, and is actually going to start sending some African Americans back to Africa. Now, I want to be clear here. The average African American in the United States does not want to go back to Africa. And that makes sense for a whole host of reasons, right? The African Americans that are living in the United States in the 1920s, they've never been to Africa. They don't know anybody in Africa. They don't practice the religion of the people in Africa. They don't speak the language of the different countries in Africa. They don't know how to farm in Africa. They know nothing about Africa. So it's why it would be like me as I think my family's Irish. I don't know if all of a sudden somebody says back to Ireland, Mr. Garrison, like I don't know anybody in Ireland. Hey, and I speak the language. It's still English, right? And I still wouldn't go. Now some African Americans will feel oppressed enough in the United States that they'll take them up on this, but very, very few. Most African Americans are going to want to stay in the United States. The reality is this, African Americans are some of the richest black people in the entire world. The economic system in the United States is so strong here that, moving to Africa, where most of the nations, particularly in the 1920s, are third world standard of living, it's not appealing. And so most African Americans in the United States will reject Marcus Garvey's idea of back to Africa. But there are things that he's saying that really do resonate with the African American community. And, he's laying groundwork for what will become known as Black nationalism, or this idea that Black people in America should be self-sufficient, they should support the Black community, and that their cultural heritage is something they should be proud of. Marcus Garvey really popularizes the phrase Black is beautiful. And this is something that most African Americans in the United States really need to hear, right? I mean, it's a thing that they can get behind, that they have been told all the way through the 1800s that Black is inferior, that they should try to be like white people or white culture. And Marcus Garvey says, hold up. Right? Hold up. You should be proud of your history. You should be proud of your heritage. You should be proud of who you are. And you are beautiful. And your culture is important and adds value. And that's something that I think is really important. And it's something that a lot of African Americans in the 1920s really need to hear and to be proud of. African Americans have contributed greatly to American culture. The arts in particular. It's crazy contributions, and Marcus Garvey recognizes that and says you should be proud of who you are. All of this should sound familiar. Guys like Stokely Carmichael in the 1960s and 70s are going to embrace Black nationalism. I think most famously Malcolm X is going to incorporate a lot of this ideology into his personal ideology. And the Black Panther movement in the 1960s and 70s, same kind of deal. Like, be proud of who you are, be proud of your culture, and it's kind of skeptical of white culture and white people in general. So be proud of your heritage, support other African Americans. Now, like I said, and also don't envy or imitate white people. You don't have to. You don't have to do that. And I think all that's kind of an important perspective that African Americans, just people in general in the United States, benefit from hearing. Now, the Back to Africa movement ends up failing. Marcus Garvey gets in trouble. He's stealing some money from the company that is shipping African Americans to Africa. That the whole system kind of just essentially ends up failing. People get dumped off. They don't have the support that they're promised when they get to Africa. So the whole Back to Africa thing, although that'll be repeated again in the 1960s, is like Stokely Carmichael will, after the 65 Voting Rights Act and the riots that ensued, he's going to start to promote Back to Africa too. Those movements will fail just because there's just not enough support for them. But Marcus Garvey also, there was some shadiness involved there. So those are the three guys, the three kind of different approaches for how, African Americans should approach, living in the United States. There are three very important intellectuals that are adding to, African American intellectual thought in the United States. Now, the 1920s isn't just about politics and intellectual thought. It's also kind of a time of cultural change, and this is going to be really kind of the first time that African American culture is going to be pop culture. Today in 2020, that makes perfect sense, right? Rap music, R&B music, most of our sports icons are all African Americans, fashion icons, African Americans, right? And so we're used to accepting African American cultural, culture as valuable. Well, in the 1920s, right, this is kind of the first time that that's happening, where jazz music in particular is becoming, very popular. And one of the most iconic places for that is going to be at the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club, there's a video attached to the PowerPoint. I suggest you watch it, kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown of the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club is in Harlem in New York, and it's kind of the epicenter of what's going to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is just this cultural and artistic movement led by African Americans in Harlem, which is an African American community. The Cotton Club is this Harlem nightclub, and and this is super interesting. Well, originally it was for whites only. And so kind of upper class white people would come in. It had a plantation theme, so it looked like like plantation. It had African Americans that were dressed in a way that, like kind of invoked slavery, and African American performers. And so today we would look at that and think that's totally racist. And it was. But for the time, it's actually a really important thing because it's white people coming to see Black artists perform. Now, it's done in a segregated facility, and that's awful, but it's the very beginning of white people recognizing the value of Black culture. And so eventually the performers get to be some of the most famous performers in the world, and they're going to apply pressure to the Cotton Club, and they're going to say, look, if you want me to keep performing, I'll do that because, it's making me money too, but you're going to have to desegregate the club. And so all of a sudden, you don't just have white people watching Black performers and valuing Black culture. You also start to have a desegregated audience. And so, the best thing you can do to eliminate racism is put the two different races together. And then all of a sudden we find out that we're really not so different, that we have more in common than we have different. And, you start to see people, kind of change their hearts and their minds. And so this is why the Cotton Club is kind of so important. One of the most famous performers is going to be a guy by the name of Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington will become a household name, one of the most famous musicians in America at the time. And that's a time where, like that, so really never happened before. And so, this Duke Ellington is on, this Black man is on the radio every night in every American's home. I mean, that's such an important thing. And I think it's a thing that gets overlooked all the time, that you can't, when you're talking about increasing tolerance in the world, which is always a good thing, right? It's, if your favorite performer is a Black man, all of a sudden that's a gut check for a lot of people. It's like, I have all these prejudices and stereotypes about, about African Americans. And, a lot of times that's because, the average white person has no connection to any Black people. And so you have all these things inside of you, and you have this idea that African Americans aren't worth anything, that they're not as good as the people around you. And then all of a sudden you hear Duke Ellington playing, and you're like, oh, holy cow, I've never heard anything like this. This guy plays so well, and all of a sudden you recognize, well, that guy has value. And I didn't think that people like him could have value. And maybe all these things I've thought for all my life, or maybe I need to reassess them. And then that's what opens up people's hearts and minds, And so, it's not just a musician. It's somebody doing something excellently, proving their worth and their culture's worth. And so it's, it's so much more important than I think some of these theoretical ideas about things. It's real, it's human, and it has an impact. Cotton Club segregated, but it exposes whites to African Americans. Eventually, will desegregate. Right? African Americans are, some of the biggest performers in the country. I've linked some videos, so if you want to check out the PowerPoint, some of the most important musicians like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, they're all household names, and just they change music. You've got a lot of very rigid white music at the time period. It's very technical and rigid, and that's great, and I like that stuff too. But then you got Ella Fitzgerald that comes along and just sings Summertime, and it's soulful and just I'm going to use the word painful because it evokes so much emotion. And Louis Armstrong that just rips on the trumpet. I mean, it may not be technical perfection, but you can feel the emotion attached to it. And that's most Americans have never experienced anything like that. It's the modern day equivalent of, going to a traditional white church versus a traditional African American church, right? I mean, they're both doing the same thing, right? They're both practicing their religion, but one is stand up, sit down, very rigid, and the other's just you can feel the emotion, and that's what's happening with music. You're also going to have guys like Langston Hughes that are writing books and poetry that are just undeniably good. I think one of Langston Hughes's most famous poem is "A Dream Deferred," which is essentially talking about like, look, African Americans, should embrace what's happening in Harlem, in the Harlem Renaissance. Like, don't just give up on your dreams and embrace the grind of just being a black man trying to get through, right? Because what happens is your dreams will dry up and explode, and you got to hold on to those things and chase your dreams. And that's like an important message for every human being, but particularly African Americans in the 1920s. It's not just happening at the Cotton Club, it's happening at the Apollo Theater, which still to this day, the Apollo Theater is like a cultural institution, right? You have not made it big in music or comedy until you play at the Apollo. And like the greatest thing about the Apollo, I think, and you can like look it up on YouTube videos, it's the crowd, man. The crowd is just generally an African American crowd that just has no mercy, man. If you're good, they let you know that you're good, and if you're not good, they let you know that you're not good. So the Apollo becomes like a rite of passage for music artists, comedians, just all kinds of people. Like, you haven't made it until you played the Apollo. The Savoy Ballroom, the Cotton Club, same thing. African American culture is spotlighted there, and it's what is driving the entertainment industry in America. And I just cannot express to you how important that is when it comes to promoting acceptance in the United States. So the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem, we've talked about before, it has kind of become the center of Black culture and intellectual life. It's mostly about literature, music, poetry, drama, plays, etc. It's not really a political movement. I mean, the intellectual thinkers are talking some politics, but it's mostly about art and music and culture. Right. We're seeing a growth in racial pride, cultural identity, and cultural pride. The African American culture is being spotlighted and highlighted in a positive light, really kind of for the first time. And so this is very important, and like, think about that. Like, think about, would we have a Martin Luther King if we didn't have the Harlem Renaissance, where he was, where we have people saying, get a PhD, go to college, and you have value, and you are beautiful, right? I mean, it's super important. It's laying the groundwork for what's going to happen later in the 1950s and 60s, even though it is mostly an artistic movement and not necessarily a political one. All right. That's where we're going to leave it off for the day. I would suggest that I've attached a PowerPoint to the video on the Google website. So I suggest pull up the PowerPoint, check out some of those videos. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is real important stuff. It's really great music. So thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again shortly.